I feel very sympathetic to a little girl having to go through such a fearful time and for so long.
Welcome to Voices of Deconversion, where atheists and agnostics share their stories of deconversion from Christianity. Now here's Steve with today's guest.
Okay, so I am here with Maria Stadtmueller. Maria is a writer from rural New Jersey. Her family was ultra-Catholic. Her uncle was a Monsignor. Maria wanted to be a nun and was obsessed about going to hell. By chance, she read Joseph Campbell in high school. He flung open the door to how humans create story and belief. Maria was a stand-up comic in New York and got a master's degree in creative writing from the University of Iowa, where she also studied religion. Her passion is the new cosmology, the science-based story of how we and our universe have evolved, and its potential to supplant religion. Her ebook, Songs That Are to Come, describes her own discovery of this story from Catholic nuns. Plus, some of it's funny. She lives on a farm in northern Vermont, where she blogs and podcasts at meetyourmyth.com. Maria, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks for having me.
So, first of all, I wanted to say something. I thought it was kind of cool that you were a stand-up comic. That's something that my whole life, even when I was a little kid, I loved watching stand-up, and I can't imagine. I think there's probably nothing more exhilarating than being on a stage in front of a bunch of people and getting them all to laugh.
Yes.
But then on the flip side, being on a stage in front of a huge group of people and throwing out a joke and nobody laughs, you know?
Yeah, that happens. And the thing is that you have to work through that. Everybody bombs. You know? Everybody bombs. And you have to work through that. I mean, you also have moments where you're doing well and you kind of, you know, you record yourself, you keep playing back your stuff, you keep perfecting it. And you also develop a stagecraft. And so you learn how to handle things and you learn how to relate to people better. And there's nothing, there's nothing like standing up. And I've had a lot of like great experiences, but there's nothing like standing up in front of total strangers and working with them and watching them lose physical control of themselves.
That's funny, yeah.
Like drinks come out their nose. and it's a healing thing. When I used to perform, there were times when I went on stage, you know, with a fever, the flu or something, which wasn't so good for the person who was coming after me and touching me. And I came off and I was cured. Hallelujah.
Yeah.
No, I mean, laughter is a wonderful thing. And George Carlin said that people are really themselves when they're laughing. And it's true. There's no pretense. Either someone finds something funny or not, and they're just, it's like having an orgasm. You can't really pretend. Well, you can pretend, and women do it all the time. But when it's actually happening, it's like sneezing. You know, it takes over. It.
Yeah, that's pretty funny. Yeah. So, you said that you consider yourself an awestruck atheist. So, yes. And you said that you've been an awestruck atheist since you came out of crawled out of your Catholic cocoon. So, what do you mean by awestruck atheist?
Well, literally, I consider myself an atheist in the Greek terminology, which is without a deity. And I don't believe in a deity. Now, you can be without a deity and be a Buddhist, for example. They have no problem with that. Mm-hmm. But I don't believe in a deity. And the awestruck part is just, you know, living on planet Earth and being aware of how we all got here and how we're part of an evolution and just the incredible, you know, you go outside and even if you live in the city or something and you see a squirrel in a tree, just the fact that squirrel has, you know, like a receding chin line that really fits a nut. You know, I mean, that's brilliant. That's just brilliant. And so there's all kinds of stuff like that. And I just think it's wonderful. And it's a real exploration, and that we can explore that while we're careening through space is, to me, just a gas.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think when you're a Christian, you think it's amazing God made all these things and it's so intricate and detailed. And so, but I've found as an atheist, it's even in some ways more amazing, and it makes you more awestruck too. Like you said, like the way that squirrel is designed or has evolved, designed, bad word, but evolved, you know.
Yeah. They have a relationship with trees and nuts, you know, and it's a reciprocal relationship, because yes, they eat the nuts and stuff, but then they're also the ones that they, the squirrel and the nut and the trees, they have a reciprocal relationship. The reason we have so many trees is in part because of a role that the squirrel plays, or, you know, in your part of the country, in the Pacific Northwest, the fact that bears eat salmon, and, you know, during a salmon run, and then they would bring the salmon in, you know, from the river. You know, first they eat the head and all the kind of really high nutrient things, and then they would leave some of it in the ground, and so that became really fertile soil. And, you know, we all are playing a role, and humans have forgotten the role we play because we've been told in our religious story that we're not from here. We're from heaven, or, you know, paradise or something. And so we've lost that. And we really need to regain it, because we're really screwing things up the way things are.
Yeah, I don't think every Christian's this way, but I think a lot of times the faith teaches you to not ask questions, to just accept that everything was created by God, and just accept that this is the way the world is, and not, you know, you don't want to, you get into science, and sometimes that's kind of scary ground for a lot of Christians to get into, you know, like evolution and things.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And yet, you know, even if you're in a faith system that acknowledges and accepts evolution and science, for example, Catholicism, they have, you know, MIT-trained Jesuits and their own astrological observatories. I've talked to some of these guys, you know, and they have access to all kinds of science, and the church does believe in evolution. They believe kind of God is behind it all, but they still get into trouble. It's still not, like, I read the
they still don't, I think, isn't it still the official doctrine of the church, of the Catholic Church, to not use birth control? Isn't that still? Yeah. So weird stuff like that. So it's like, yeah, maybe, and they've progressed a lot more than I think some of the real conservative Christian, and that's kind of where I come from. And so, but you're right. I think John Paul II, I think, said something like evolution was more than just a theory or something.
I think it was actually before that. It
It
might have been, it might have been before that. But then, of course, you know, Francis, people are thinking, oh, he's going to change everything, but he's not. He's not going to change doctrine. You know, he can change the flavorings basically, but not the stock. So,
yeah, it's kind of like politicians. You know, president gets in, and depending what party you think, maybe there's some big changes, and sometimes there is, but a lot of times it's like just a different person in there, but pretty much same result. You know, kind of thing.
Absolutely.
So, when did you become a Christian, and what was your religious upbringing?
I did not become a Christian. I was born into it. I was a cradle Catholic, and there was no choice. Although, you know, well, I'll get back to that. But yeah, my family was my father's family, Southern German Catholics. They were very devout. My mother was a convert, and they're the worst. I look at, I mean, first of all, who converts to Catholicism? Come on. You know?
Yeah, that seems kind of crazy. I know. It's so rigid, and it just seems so strict to go into that. That's an interesting choice for her.
You know, it's weird, though, because it's such a huge Catholicism is a huge organization. It's a huge mindset. And there are, along the periphery, depending on when you're living, there are like the mystics, like Francis of Assisi, Hildegard von Bingen, all these people who, Meister Eckhart, when you read their stuff, you think, they were really onto it. Well, they were usually abused during their time by the the powers
by
that
the
be.
church.
Yeah. But it's such a huge tradition. But in my case, like my father, it was just kind of assumed, you were Catholic. But the religion part was my mother's department. And she had converted to Catholicism from, her family was marginally Greek Orthodox. But, they were immigrants and they were more, trying to make it in this country than engaging in any kind of real spirituality. But my mother became Catholic. And that to me is like the difference between having naturally curly hair and getting a really bad perm. Because she doesn't know nearly what I knew or what I know from having studied it, so I can take her very easily. Yeah. So we had, statues all over the house. We said the rosary in the car. And the thing was, I'm so old that when I first went to Catholic school, it was before Vatican II. We were still doing the Latin. We still sang Gregorian chant, which I love. And a lot of it was very earthy and fleshy. You have the May crowning, where you crown the statue of Mary with flowers, and you sing this song. And a lot of the Catholic songs, at least in this country, are based on Irish drinking songs.
Weird.
It is weird. But you celebrated the seasons in a certain way. So that was very appealing. That part really grabs you and was very appealing. But then
a lot of tradition.
Yeah. And I think they made a real mistake when they switched over to the vernacular from the Latin, because then you could understand it and you're just like, well, this doesn't make any sense.
Oh. So they used to just read it in Latin, and then they at some point changed and started reading it in English, or the native language of the people they were.
Well, yeah. The Mass, the Mass is always the same. The readings change and everything, but there's this like core structure of the Mass, of the liturgy. Mm-hmm. And that's always the same. So you knew what was going on. And you kind of, through osmosis, you would learn stuff, especially singing the Mass in Latin. You learn kind of what's going on. But it left you to your own devices in Latin to just kind of get out of it whatever you were going to get out of it. And then once they changed it over to English, it was like, this is what the belief is. And I found myself bumping up against it.
Did it kind of take some of the mystical part of that away? So
Absolutely.
Some of the mystery a little bit, and it's like, oh, it's just, that's what it is?
Absolutely. When, for example, they turned the priest used to have his back to you, right? And so he's doing all this stuff with the host and the wine and all this kind of stuff. And then they switched it around. So you had this altar and he faced the people. And that was supposed to be really groovy, that, wow.
He's facing us.
Well,
we can see his face.
Well, you could also see him chewing. You could see him chewing the host and stuff.
Oh, the host being the cracker or whatever. Yeah. We used to use like saltines. This
really?
Is, yeah. In my conservative church, we it was the Covenant denomination, which is just pretty much a conservative evangelical denomination, and it would be grape juice and like a cracker, like a saltine, just broken up. Isn't that weird?
Yes,
yeah,
they usually
not as traditional.
They usually have hydrogenated vegetable oil. But what's weird?
That's funny.
Is that, the hosts, and they're usually made by nuns. They're usually baked by nuns. And they're made from wheat flour. And so there are people who have, terrible gluten allergies, or a lot of Irish people, for example, have, what's that disease? Celiac disease, where it's life-threatening to them to eat wheat. And yet the church would not allow them to use like rice flour or something. I mean, there was a girl in Jersey who made her first communion with a rice flour, and they negated it because, I guess Jesus is made out of wheat. I don't know.
Well, I was going to say, especially the Catholic Church, and I don't know if it's still true, but they believe that it actually becomes the body of Christ.
Damn straight, buddy.
So literally, they're allergic to God.
Yes. Transubstantiation.
That kind of sucks.
Yeah. And we were taught all this kind of stuff, like you're not supposed to chew it. There was this whole protocol you had to go through if, like, the priest dropped the host while he was giving communion, because the altar boy held this thing under your chin. So in case the host dropped, you caught it, you were safe. But you had to do this whole thing, and
wow. much more exciting than in my background, that's for sure. I mean, we never even had wine. When I went to a Lutheran college, that's the first time I ever experienced like wine out of a chalice for communion,
Well, we didn't have that. We didn't drink wine out of a chalice or any. Maybe people do now. I think maybe some of them do, but and that
it was weird.
Supposedly, according to church doctrine and transubstantiation, the wine is the actual blood of Jesus. And so, that's, Which is so weird, I mean, it's so weird. When I learned that in Bible school, I learned that about, because I'd grown up just believing it was a symbol. And I'm like, okay, I get it, a symbol, whatever. Yeah. But then you learned that some people did and actually believe it becomes his actual blood. It's his actual flesh. Right.
It doesn't taste like it. Right. Tastes and looks like a cracker, but it's Jesus's flesh you're chewing on,
Yeah, right.
So weird.
It is weird. It's
But you grow up in it, and it's just normal.
You grow up in it, and it's a mystery. Yeah. That was always like the default explanation. It's a mystery. And I'm all for mysteries, but it's a little weird.
Yeah. So was there anything, as you grew up, so you were born into it, you said it was just part of your upbringing, but was there anything that influenced your faith in a significant way? Was there a person that you looked up to, or was there any kind of event as you grew and as your faith matured, as you got older, anything that influenced it the most? Or
well, since I was educated by nuns in two different orders of nuns in two different schools, they were a big model for me, even though a lot of them were mean. And that whole sister with a ruler thing has become really its own meme. And there were reasons for that. They were under such pressure by the male hierarchy. They weren't usually as well educated as they are now. There were a lot of repressive things going on while, you say, during the boom in Catholic schools and parochial schools. First of all, you had the baby boom, and Catholics were breeding like flies, and we had like 50 kids in a class. And so you have one nun with 50 kids in the class. And now, of course, we understand about learning disabilities and things like that. But, what's this woman supposed to do? Except be really strict, because that's the only way you could keep chaos from ensuing. But there were a few nuns that I had. I remember Sister Leona, who I truly loved. And she was like from Brooklyn. And then we had this principal, Sister Lucy, who was this slender, elegant woman who played the organ. And she had beautiful bone structure. And she was just a very graceful, gracious person. And I remember thinking to myself that that was the kind of woman I wanted to grow up to be, And I lived in a weird place in that where I grew up, there was a real class system, kind of like Downton Abbey. But we had a lot of fabulously wealthy people living around us.
And this was in New Jersey?
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of people, like Jackie O lived out there. My dad was a horseshoer, and he used to shoe her horses. And they went to our church. So one of the things that kept me going to Catholic church longer than I would have was the possibility of seeing the extremely hot JFK Jr.
That's so funny. That's cool, though, that they went to your church. That's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. When they were, they had a place in New York, but then, she used to fox hunt. And so they would come out to their place in the country, and that was where we lived. And so, so JFK Jr. kept me going to Mass. But
that's funny.
Because there had been a lot of sugar barons and railroad barons and people who, had seats on the stock exchange and stuff who lived there, because we were like an hour and a half outside of New York. There were these huge estates. And then, when they started with income taxes and everything, a lot of the rich people sold these places cheaply to nuns because they didn't have to pay taxes. So we had all these mother houses, all these hives for the production of nuns in our area. And you could hear the bells ringing from where we were in the valley when they were ringing the Angelus. That's a Catholic thing. Like certain times of the day, the bells ring and you say prayers.
Oh, interesting. That's almost reminds me of Islam,
Yeah, exactly.
They got to drop and do the prayer, 5 times a day.
And I used to drop. I mean, I remember if I were out in the field riding my pony and I heard the Angelus bells, I would dismount and get down and kneel and say the prayers.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. I had no idea that was a Catholic thing at all.
Oh, yeah.
I'd never heard of that.
Oh, yeah.
That's cool.
When you hear, if you ever hear bells ringing at, I think it's at 12 and 3 and 6, there are songs. It's about the angel of the Lord declared unto Mary, and she was conceived of the Holy Spirit, and then you say Hail Mary. It's called a sacramental. It's part of the smells and bells, that was very much a part of Catholicism.
Wow, that's interesting. So as you grew older, I think, especially if you grew up in the church, you start to personalize your faith. So there's all these traditions, and there's the way your dad did Catholicism. There's the way that your mom did it. But of course, as you grew older, probably you personalized it in some ways and made it, there's probably certain things about your faith that were really important to you. What were those things, or how did you personalize your faith and kind of make it your own?
Well,
or did you? I mean,
I wanted to be a nun from an early age. In fact, my first career goal was to be a virgin martyr. I did.
Oh, now that's interesting.
And I didn't know what a virgin was. I knew what a martyr was. I thought, and I had been named after this Italian girl, Maria Goretti, who had been stabbed on her kitchen floor because she wouldn't put out for the farmhand who lusted after her.
Oh yeah. My gosh.
Yeah. And she was canonized, made a saint around, shortly a couple years before I was born. And so, anyway, yeah, I wanted to be a nun. I saw myself, in fact, I wanted to be a cloistered nun.
What's a cloistered nun? What would that be?
Well, there are different kinds of nuns. And actually a nun technically is one who is, a monastic. And then, a religious sister could be like a teaching order and everything. A cloistered nun lives in a cloister, lives in, I'm not going to need to find the words now, dig them up out of the, out of the archives.
Well, as much as you can remember. I was just curious. I'd never heard that term. Okay,
so you are you withdraw from society and you live in a monastery or a cloister and you pray and you're silent most of the time. And a lot of cloistered nuns believe that they are praying for the good of others and for the good of the world and stuff. Like a Carmelite, they're usually that's a cloistered order. So you give up everything and you live with the same people for the rest of of your life. And it's a very hard thing to do because you still have to deal with these people, and they're going to bug the hell out of you over the course of time. But that to me was not the bug the hell out of you part being appealing, but the withdrawal was very appealing to me. The silence was very appealing to me.
That's interesting. There's something really neat about being in seclusion or silence, or I think of being in nature and and just having that peace. It's kind of a peaceful thing.
Yeah.
But I remember hearing stories of, I don't even know her name, may have been a nun, but, hundreds of years ago, a woman secluding herself into a house for God, and she lived there by herself with a cat, and like people would slip food under the door to her. She wouldn't talk to anyone, and she lived her entire life out that way and died.
Yeah.
And I just thought, how horrible, especially now that I don't believe in any kind of afterlife.
Yeah.
She's done. That's it. That was her existence. She lived in a house and didn't talk to anybody. That sounds so horrible. But, like we were saying, there's something kind of fascinating and appealing about that.
Well, that's
still not that, but what you were saying.
That's being a hermit, and that's different.
Different, yeah.
From being part of an enclosed community. I discovered when you were saying, when did you become Catholic or Christian? There was this kind of interim period in my early childhood before I was indoctrinated, where I would have these incredible experiences in nature. I can still feel some of those experiences. I was a very little kid. I was probably 3 or so, and walking through one of our fields. And I remember it was probably in June or so, and just lying down and looking up at the sky and just hearing all the buzzing around me of, different bees and bugs and stuff. And there were wild strawberries all around me, and I could just reach out and pick and eat a wild strawberry. And those kinds of experiences, because we were outside a lot, and because we had horses, we could go riding off into the hills, and it was this beautiful area at the time. It's gotten more built up with like huge mansions, but that got to me before the church got to me.
That's cool.
And ultimately, that's what I came back to. It's like they told me, no, what you're feeling is Jesus. They were feeling, I would say, my personal brand or whatever of religion. I never got the Jesus thing. I never, they said you're supposed to love Jesus with all your heart and love Jesus more every day. And I think I pretended that I was doing that, but I didn't really get it. And I think part of the reason was Jesus seemed so crabby, I mean, he was never happy, at least in the descriptions that we heard, and you always saw him like with holes in himself and don't you have faith in me? And it was a very kind of punitive view of someone, it was really,
which is sad.
It was glorifying suffering and death. And, in Catholic school at the time, it was like all death all the time. It was just like martyrs, and we had a Martyr of the Month calendar.
Oh my gosh.
Oh yeah, like people getting whacked, different people getting whacked by Romans every month. And the funny thing was, so you had this Martyr of the Month calendar, right? And you were also surrounded by pictures in your classroom of people who had their eyes poked out or their heads chopped off and, you know, been burned on a grill or something. And on the Martyr of the Month calendar, you'd have, Saint Catherine being bound to the Catherine wheel, which was covered with knives. And then it said, compliments of Bailey's funeral home. It was...
So they like made the calendar?
Yes.
Or they supplied the money to... That's so ridiculous. That's like a combination of big business, you know, big church, you know, and psychological abuse for children or whatever.
Exactly. And
all wrapped up in a big package.
And I think the worst thing was the guilt, you know, and Catholicism is famous for guilt. And from what I gather, you know, having listened to your interview with Chrissy, I mean, that was a big part of her life. So it's not just Catholicism. But the problem with Christianity, one of the major problems with Christianity, and there are so many, is that there is this perfect God. You have this perfect God who can do no wrong. So if anything happens to you in your life that is uncomfortable or painful or disastrous or unfortunate, well, it could be, it's either that this earth is cursed and we're cursed, you know, we're forced to live here until we can move on to perfection if we get there, or we did something bad and now we're being punished. Instead of realizing that it's an imperfect world, everything's a bubble off plum. That's how stuff evolves. That's how emergence happens. Like, you know, Leonard Cohen says, well, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets.
That's a neat quote. I like that.
So, you know, the belief in this perfect God is really a problem for people, because, you know, you look at the ancient Romans, the ancient Greeks, whatever, you know, they had all these different gods, and some of them, you know, they had the same faults as people. And that was part of what you had to deal with. You know, if your ship went up against the rocks, well, you know, Poseidon was messing with you. Because he could be funky, you know, but you don't have that option with Christianity.
Yeah, you internalize it. It's either your fault or it's the fault of your great grandfather and grandmother who ate the fruit from the tree. Right. You know, it's pretty much your fault. You know, any way you slice it, God's not to blame. You know, he's never wrong.
No, of course not. Of course not. It's, you know, and, well, you know, your predecessors, Adam and Eve, disobeyed God. And so, in fact, you know, Augustine believed that original sin was sexually transmitted. He believed that it was in semen.
That's so, and church fathers have believed so many crazy things. Just add that to the list, right? Yeah. I mean, just the ridiculous stuff they believed, you know?
Well, but the unfortunate thing about Augustine is that so many, you know, Martin Luther was an Augustinian monk. And he was a great admirer of Augustine. So for some reason, most of Christianity went that way, where humans were spiritual train wrecks because of Adam and Eve, that was inherited. There was no way out of it. And, you know, you just have to, you know, and of course, Augustine was a horn dog, you know, he had and his father was a horn dog, you know,
I didn't know anything about his personal life. I mean, from what I learned, he was just like this great saint, you know, but apparently not.
Oh, he was a real womanizer when he started, you know, when he was young. I mean, there's that famous quote of his, "Oh, dear God,
early on,
make me holy, but not yet." He had an illegitimate child from a concubine who he lived with, and then he had to give up his relationship with her when his mother made a better match for him.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, I mean, a lot of his issues come from his groin, basically. I would like to write something called Augustine's Crotch, Gateway to Western Civilization, because it really had an incredible effect.
Oh my goodness. That's so weird. So you said early in your childhood, there was a real connection with nature. Then the church kind of got a hold of you, and you were thinking about, as time went on, you want to be a nun. You kind of looked up to some of the nuns that you learned under. So at some point, the questions or doubts start creeping in, mm-hmm. or maybe they become louder. Mm-hmm. So when did that start to happen for you?
Part of it was, I think, starting to see priests and nuns, and my parents for that matter, as fallible humans, and seeing them do stuff like lie. I remember, for example, the Mother Superior was coming to our school, and so we got ready. I remember we were scrubbing the floors and everything, and we also we learned how to sight sing music, solfeggio. And so the nun would write the notes down on the board, and we would learn how to sing it. And then when the Mother Superior came and we sang it, this thing that had been on the board for about a week that we had practiced, and Sister said, "Yes, and they've never seen this before, Mother. They're just singing that from, their knowledge of music." I was like, "What?"
You're like, wait a second, that's not true.
Hold on. So there were little things like that. And then there was the, becoming interested in boys and that whole conflict. It kind of makes you question things. But I think for me, the biggest factor was reading Joseph Campbell. I didn't know who he was. I picked up this book, I don't know, in like the drugstore or something. I don't know why they were selling Joseph Campbell in the local drugstore. It was called Myths to Live By. It wasn't even one of his more famous books. And I remember sitting and reading this, and I very clearly remember the summer days that I was reading this. And he explained how humans make stuff up to fulfill their psychological needs. And he said over and over that you can't get hung up on the symbol. What does the symbol stand for? What is it that people need to live that they create symbols for? Because humans are really a symbolic species. And we've always needed that. So that changed things remarkably. Also, I remember the first moon landing. And, we had been told that Mary ascended bodily into heaven. But she was assumed bodily into heaven. Jesus ascended, but Mary was assumed bodily into heaven. Well, where the hell did she go, man? Did she go into orbit? I mean...
Well, that's what... I've wondered that, too. I remember learning that Christians believe he physically went up to heaven, like in a physical body. Yeah. And I remember in Bible school sitting around with some guys. It was a small group of guys, and we were all Christian. We were all talking about stuff, and that came up. And I was not Christian at that point. I was at Bible school kind of still figuring out what I believed, but I knew I wasn't Christian, and so I had lots of questions and doubts about stuff. And I remember bringing that up and saying something like, so is Jesus just like floating around by Jupiter or something? and this one guy looked at me and he was like, yeah, yeah, that's crazy, but I believe it. I mean, you're like, this is so silly, and it's so horrible to have to believe silly stuff like that.
Well, anyway. And I think one of the reasons why so many people are leaving religion, and in this country, leaving Christianity in droves, is because the story doesn't hold up anymore. Humans need stories. That's our operating system. You can see that in families, when families exchange stories about maybe hardships they went through, or special events that they've had, or people in the family who kind of demonstrate a certain point. But the Christian story doesn't make sense anymore. You can go into scripture, and of course, as Catholics, we didn't bother with the Bible. We never read the Bible, man.
Interesting.
You didn't need any of that.
Yeah.
I mean, the priests
just follow traditions and the priests, yeah.
And they would tell us what we needed to know. But we had to memorize the Baltimore Catechism. You had to know all this stuff about Catholicism and the X number of sins and the X number of virtues and all this kind of stuff. But you can go into scripture and find stuff that might somehow sync up with something in modern life. But why would you have to, having to comb through scripture to find agreement with what we know from science is crap. What deity who was all-knowing and wanted us to follow certain ideas would make it that obscure,
Yeah, make it that hard to figure out.
Exactly.
It should be clear as day, just right there, yeah.
Right, and the fact that you need to learn Hebrew and Greek in order to understand it, that doesn't make sense. I mean, I forget where I was going with that, but
well, you were talking about Joseph Campbell, and we got kind of sidetracked onto how Jesus is orbiting, and Mary is probably up there orbiting somewhere. Maybe they're in the asteroid belt and they're hiding behind a rock or something,
right? So,
but Joseph Campbell, so that was really the thing. Reading that book, learning about that idea that myth has meaning.
Yes.
And what was it about that really kind of hooked on to you, that you were like, okay, this really makes sense? And what about it kind of started to pull you away from Catholicism?
Well, he was talking, for example, in this one particular book about how the story of a virgin who gave birth to a half god, half man, who was then kind of sacrificed for the good of a group of people, exists in other cultures, and in cultures that predate Christianity, and even in cultures that have had no connection with Christianity in, say, South America or Central America. Wow. That, Jesus, I think in one book he described Jesus basically as being a vegetable god, that it's the kind of thing that people have always created to make sense of their world. Meanwhile, we now, because of science, know about deep time, which we have never known before. Unless you were a mystic or a shaman or something, that time goes on infinitely, and that we're part of this, we can see back through time, through how stars formed and things like that. It's so much bigger than these little stories that we were forced to believe,
Yeah, and maybe from a distance you can appreciate them now, but when that is all you're taught is true, when the Bible is it, and you're told that's all you need to know, that's all we need to know about the history of the universe, it's kind of sad, because when you start to learn, there's so much more, and there's so much more information out there, and it just seems so insignificant. There's value in it now, sure. But still, it's so limited, and it should be limited. It was something that was written 2,000 and 3,000 years ago,
right?
So it shouldn't have all the answers for all time, and it doesn't. And maybe that was some of the excitement as you read through Joseph Campbell and learning there's this whole world of, interesting information out there, or a different way to look at it, maybe.
Well, yeah. And, a way of looking at being human, that we use symbol, that we use myth and story, and that every wisdom tradition, whether it's Christianity or Buddhism or Zoroastrianism or whatever, there's always wisdom in there. People wouldn't have made it up if that weren't the case. There are always kernels of wisdom in there, but you can't fit what we know now about the universe into those stories, because it just doesn't work. it's too big for those stories, and rightfully so, because those people, you know, the Hebrews were a goat herding, warlike tribe in the Middle East, you know, and they had struggles to survive. It's a kind of a harsh environment, and they developed stories to give them comfort and to give them direction. But that doesn't mean that we have to use those same stories. I heard a guy on the radio yesterday, in fact, I think he was the astronomer royal or whatever they call, like the head astronomer dude in Great Britain. And he was saying, well, you know, in our galaxy alone, in the Milky Way, there are probably 1 billion planets, and we're finding evidence of water. We don't know if there's life. Maybe there is. We don't know what kind of life. But when you look at things from that perspective, why is the right and wrong system of a group of late Bronze Age goat herders the only way to go?
Yeah.
This doesn't make sense.
There's a whole variety of cultures out there and stories out there that are interesting, and we can gain meaning from, not just those stories.
Right. And everybody has them. Everybody makes their stuff up, you know. It just so happens that this particular story was, you know, Christianity was one of the cults that was active in the Roman Empire. And Constantine, the emperor, decided that he was going to throw his hat in with that particular group of people because he saw potential there, you know, political, religious, I don't know. The jury's still out on whether he was actually a Christian or not. Yeah.
So as you learned more and your beliefs maybe started to change during that time, was there anything that kind of kept you hanging on to your Catholic faith?
Sure. Yeah. The guilt, you know, what if I'm wrong? You know, this doesn't make sense, but, you know, maybe I don't know enough about it, or maybe I'm not devout enough, or, you know, maybe I'm not dedicated enough. But I think, so there was the guilt, but even deeper than that was the gut instinct that I can be a spiritual person and I can be a good person by just living on earth. And all the awe and wonder I need is right here. So, you know, and also my family structure, you know, my parents certainly didn't like it when I started to pull away, and I had to keep up a certain amount of appearances, you know, while I was still in high school. Once I went off to college, you know, then it became different. And
so when you were in high school, that's when you started to read Joseph Campbell?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so mentally you're kind of pulling away, but you're not fully out yet, out of the church, because your parents, obviously, that would be a huge controversy within your house, probably.
Yeah. And, you know, when the family was getting ready to go to Mass, which of course you have to do every Sunday or it's a mortal sin, and I think they still believe that, the whole family's getting ready to go to Mass, and I would just say, no, I'm going for a hike. And big arguments would ensue. And I would say, my God lives in a field and in the forest and not in a church. And it was just so boring. Church was just so boring, man.
Yeah.
Why would you want to go and be bored?
And sit and listen to some guy who's not even facing you. Well, at least for a while.
And of course, with Catholics, you're not only sitting, you're kneeling, you're standing, you're sitting, you're kneeling. And I still know how to do that. I still know when to do that.
That's amazing.
Yeah,
it becomes ingrained, just something that is just part of your memory forever.
Right.
Yeah.
It's your body memory. Yep. If I go to a funeral or something, like a Catholic funeral, which is like the only time I go to church, if it's a wedding or a funeral or something, I still know how to do that stuff.
Now, you mentioned that hell, you were, I don't remember how it was worded, but you were obsessed with hell. That's what you said.
Yeah.
So was it the fear of going to hell? Was that what you were obsessed with?
Yeah. And yes, I was certain that I was going to hell. And in fact, in Catholicism, that's so common, we call it the scruples. And Martin Luther had a healthy dose of that too, which is why he joined a monastery, because there was a bad thunderstorm, and he promised Saint Anne that who you pray to if there's a bad thunderstorm.
Oh, right. Obviously. I mean, that's what I would think. Saint Anne, of course.
Yeah. I mean, who else would you call, right?
Yeah.
Who are you going to call?
She's the master of that. Yeah.
So he promised her that if she saved him and he lived through this thunderstorm, that he would become a monk. So there you go. But what were we talking about?
Let's see. Hell.
Oh, hell.
Hell. Your fear of hell. The scruples.
Oh, man. Yeah. I was... the nuns always told us, don't touch yourself. Don't touch yourself. But they never told us where.
They meant the elbow, Maria. They just meant the elbow.
I used to go to confession and
So you're good.
and confess. Like, I touched my armpit 3 times. And I used to bathe. I used to shower with a big sponge that we used, like the kind we used for washing horses. Because that way I wouldn't feel any of the contours of my body, because I wasn't sure where the danger zone was.
Oh, that's horrible for a child or a person growing up to think that they're going to get in trouble. Like, they're just trying to, like, clean off,
One time.
Or clean up, yeah.
After school, one time I was sitting and reading the comics and having a snack. And my hand was in my lap. And I thought, oh my God, I'm touching myself in an impure way. And I burst into tears and I started crying. I used to vomit a lot when I was a kid because of this kind of thing. And my mother, to her credit, said, look, I'm touching myself. I'm touching myself. I'm touching myself. You're not doing anything wrong by sitting there with your hand in your lap. Of course, she never wanted to talk about sex or anything. We never talked about that. But it was obsessive. If I could swing the paddock gate closed the first time, then I wasn't going to hell. If that butterfly landed on that flower, I wasn't going to hell. My older sister was this way as well, and she would obsessively floss her teeth and brush her teeth, and she wore out 2 electric toothbrushes. She wore out the motors.
Whoa.
It's a very obsessive, compulsive, it's a sickness. It's sick.
Wow. And that's so sad, you just think of like the damage it does to people, kids growing up. And as much as parents I don't think parents think about all the little things that kids are internalizing. So when you're hearing these rules and these things the nuns or the priests are telling you, as a child, you're trying to internalize it. How does this apply to my life? And I think religion in its purest form is something that you obsess about.
Yeah.
I think it's just, if you really are devoted to God, then you'll show it in every little thing you do, like in the way that you're sitting while you're reading the comics. It just becomes so difficult to do it right. It's so confusing for kids, I think, going through this. Yeah, that's really sad.
It's a really, it's a very negative experience, and it primes you for a lot of neurosis. Did I ever tell you about how I found out that why I was afraid to fly in an airplane?
No.
I was always terrified of flying. Even before I ever got on a plane. I didn't get on a plane until I was in college because, we didn't have money to travel or anything. But I was always, when I would see a plane, and for me, flying was terrible. I had to get like really drunk. And then I switched over to lorazepam. And I tried everything. I tried hypnosis. I tried fearful flyer classes. And then I spoke with this woman who did what she called educational kinesiology. Mm-hmm. Where in your body stores these messages, and you don't even know that your nervous system is kind of programmed to to act this way. But we came through, she was doing muscle testing, which is a way of understanding if your body knows something that your mind is kidding you about. What we came up with through a 2-hour session of doing this was that to fly, you had to be pure, because in Catholicism, there's a lot of flying. There's angels and there's Jesus going into heaven and Mary going into heaven and angels coming down and all this kind of stuff. And of course, they were all very pure, and I wasn't pure. Even as an adult, even when I had abandoned all this belief system, I still felt that somewhere in my body. And so she cleared this by tapping on different meridians and stuff. And the next time I flew, I really felt rewired.
Wow.
And I don't like turbulence and stuff, so I'll have a drink if things are rough, but it was nothing like before. It's like 90% different.
Wow. That kind of stuff lingers with you.
Yeah.
The teachings of the church and that you're a horrible, sinful, evil being that needs saving,
It's in your body. You internalize it,
Yeah. So in high school and in college, that's when obviously your doubts became really strong. Was there a moment you realized, I don't believe this anymore, or was it progressive over time?
It was progressive. At the time when I was in college, I was studying anthropology and studying all kinds of different stuff. And you meet different kinds of people, and you meet people who don't believe anything, or people who believe different stuff. And of course, the clincher for me was the first time I had sex because I had kept myself so pure.
You didn't even put your hands on your lap when you were watching comics.
Nope.
I mean, So then that happened. Okay.
So, and I had always, I felt so guilty about, like anything like French kissing, or, if a guy tries to cop a feel or something, it's like, oh my God, I'm going to hell. And I was always running to confession. And I thought for sure that, God, I could never have sex with someone outside of marriage because I would just feel so guilty. Well, then, I started moving away from the church. And by the time I got to college, I was really bound and determined to lose my virginity. You're
like, that's it. This is going to happen.
Well, because I didn't want my parents, there was no place to get birth control, or, where no one knew my parents because we lived in a small, town. So there really wasn't any way to be sexual in our household that was healthy. So once I got out of there and I was in college, and I had this relationship with a boyfriend, and it lasted for years and years. And the first time we had sex, I had thought that I was going to feel incredibly guilty, but instead I felt like $1,000,000. I felt great. And that was the proof to me right there, in a very kind of profane way that...
Well, you're being told if you do this outside of what the church says is okay, it's bad. And usually bad things don't feel right. At least, even if if you stole a cookie when you were a kid, you'd feel kind of that guilt inside, or that bad feeling. And it's so interesting, you go through this experience, like so many kids that age, and then it's like, oh, this actually isn't, not only is it not bad, it's actually pretty awesome.
And it's life affirming, I mean, it comes with responsibility, but, for yourself, for your own well-being, for the well-being of the person you're with, unless you're into casual sex or something. And,
most of the time there's a relationship involved, and it's very, it bonds you with that other person. It's something that's very, it's one of the wonderful things about life.
Yeah, exactly. And why not? It's fun. You can have at home with just stuff, you have.
That's free
around the house. Yeah, it's free. Unless, like in your case, you thought that you had to have kids all the time, that you weren't allowed.
Then, that's not cool. Yeah. Then it's very expensive.
Well, my parents, I think, had that problem too, because, you weren't supposed to use birth control. And my parents had my sister and my brother on the rhythm method. So.
Yeah, no, I know about that because I looked into all of those things, when we were thinking about not using birth control, but I knew nothing about Catholicism. But then at that point in my life, when we were about to get married, I learned all about the different ways that Catholics have mastered not getting pregnant,
natural
without using.
Yeah
isn't that crazy?
Yeah, right.
So that was kind of maybe the time in your life, or that event or whatever, that kind of solidified these doubts. So obviously you grew up in a Catholic home. You probably had lots of friends and family that were Catholic. Was there anyone that you told about these doubts? I mean, it seemed like maybe in high school, I don't know, did you have friends that you would tell, or in college, were there people you talked to about kind of your lack of belief?
Well, it wasn't, a lot of my friends, both in high school and then in college, this was a Tony liberal arts school, and religion really wasn't that big a deal. People weren't that religious, I went to school with a lot of kind of non-practicing New York Jews, and I always liked Jewish men, and so that was different too, because they don't care about Jesus. And they weren't.
So it was a non-issue for you at that time in your surrounding, because you were at college, so you weren't around your parents.
Yeah, no, it wasn't an issue at college at all. I mean, with my parents, it was a problem. And I remember, for example, when my dad was dying, this was in 2000, and he was dying of cancer. He was in the hospital and he was suffering, and my mother was sitting there and I was there, and she wanted me to pin all these things to him, like these holy medals and stuff like that. And I thought to myself, why don't we just sacrifice a chicken and cover all our bases? She said,
I know.
He has to wear this so he doesn't go to hell. And I'm thinking, of course, by this time I was way out of it. And it's like, well, what kind of system is that? Where, plus in Catholicism, there were things that changed where, before Vatican II, if you ate meat on Friday, you were going to hell. So you're in hell with Hitler because you had a ham sandwich,
Yeah.
And as a vegetarian, I object to the ham sandwich, but I don't think it's going to send you to hell. And then all of a sudden, it wasn't a mortal sin anymore. Well, what happened to all those people who went to hell on a meat wrap,
Yeah. That's not cool. Sitting in hell going, hey, this guy over here killed 6 million people. What's going on? That's not fair. So did your parents find out about you being an atheist?
I don't think my father ever really knew I was an atheist. We never really discussed it. He would say things, when I wouldn't go to mass, for example, he would say things like, oh, you'll be Catholic someday when you're lying in the middle of the road and a tractor trailer has lost its brakes and is coming toward your head. And, he would develop these very kind of gothic scenarios under which I would return to the church. My mother would always say novenas for me. That's where you'd go to mass 9 days in a row for a special intention. And,
So did they have an idea you were not totally Catholic?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But they never, you never told them outright, hey, I'm an atheist. I don't believe any of this.
I think I told her I don't believe any of this, but, my mother had her, and still has her inability. There are certain places where the information doesn't sink in, and it's just, so what do you believe? Some kind of American Indian religion? And it's like, no.
No, I'm just in touch with nature, Mom.
Yeah, right.
It's not that crazy.
But, at one point, and of course my siblings started to leave as well. And at one point, my mother consoled herself by saying, well, at least my children are all still Democrats. And I don't even consider myself a Democrat anymore. I consider myself too radical for that. But they didn't want to deal with it. And with my father, it was pretty easy because religion was my mother's department. And my mother just kind of, I don't know what she makes up in her head about what's going to happen with her kids. She's probably still praying for me, that I don't go to hell or something. And
what's it feel like to know that someone who's close to you in your life has gone and done, I don't remember how to say it.
Novena?
Novena?
Yeah, I mean, it's from the Latin for 9.
9. So what's it feel like to think, here's someone who went to Mass, you said, 9 days in a row for you?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about that?
Oh, whatever floats your boat. I mean, if that's what
Yeah. I mean, I would just be like, oh, Mom, come on, you don't got to do this. Like 9 days in a row, really? It's going to be okay, Mom.
Well,
it's like, oh boy.
It's, yeah. I mean, I would say now I tell people, I'm much more upfront about telling people I'm an atheist because I think they should know that more people are atheists.
I agree, and I feel the same way, and that's one of the reasons that it's hard to say it. I mean, at first it was really hard for me to say the word atheist, but I agree, because people, every time I can tell you just off the top of my head, several people I've told I was atheist, and one of the first things they say is, oh, well, I wouldn't go that far, or, well, I don't like atheists.
Yeah,
they're mean.
Well, and also atheists, when it comes to like online dating or something, atheists are the people nobody wants to date. Like people would rather, in surveys have indicated that people will rather date someone who, I don't know, has a criminal record than someone who's an atheist.
There was it was a Pew Research poll or some research poll came out, and we were the least trusted group of Americans of any group.
Right. And
there was some kind of criminal aspect, like that. Like someone would rather date someone who had like a criminal background than an atheist. And you just think, really? So they have like tangible history of doing bad things.
Right.
We just don't believe something.
Right.
It's so crazy.
And not only do we not believe something, but the burden of proof is technically, logically on the people who do believe the thing. The burden of proof is on them. But I do tell people that I'm an atheist, and I do it with a smile on my face because, for example, we have Mennonites in our area, and some of them came by to proselytize, and they said, hi, we're from the Mennonite church and blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, thanks for coming over, but I'm an atheist. I said, we're both atheists. And I'm very pleasant about it to make it sound like, and then I'll say, well, it's awfully hot. Would you like a glass of water or something? It's like, look, I'm actually a nice person. Because a lot of people confuse atheism with nihilism, where nothing.
It's hopeless. It's pointless.
Yeah. And it's not. I mean, once you get rid of all those unfortunate constructs, you can practice your spirituality. You can go within yourself and find what is good and true in you and good and true in other people. And, you don't have to have that kind of story to live a beautiful life.
Yeah, and that's the wonderful thing, I think when you discover that as a person, it's a beautiful thing. Yeah. You discover there's so many wonderful things to live for and to be interested in, and you don't need all of that religion to do it.
And that doesn't mean that life is necessarily easier, because you're still going to have issues. You're still going to suffer. I mean, one of the things that I have found very useful, I read a lot about Buddhism, among other things, and that whole idea of attachment causing suffering, that you're attached to something, either you want to keep it or you want to repel it, and that's what causes suffering. I think that's a very wise thing, and I think meditation is an important thing. Learning how to meditate, just learning how to go within, however you do that, and just be quiet and see what's happening with you. Helping other people, however you choose to do it. It's a huge world out there, and we need people to do a lot of stuff.
Yeah. So when your beliefs obviously changed quite a bit. So when you now look back at the Catholic Maria,
mm-hmm.
what do you think about that person now?
I feel very sympathetic to a little girl having to go through such a fearful time and for so long. So I feel sympathy. I feel a certain degree of gratitude because I have no idea what I would be like if I hadn't gone through that. So, but it kind of wired me for ritual in a way, and wired me for an appreciation of sensory things as being holy, which is a very different thing, I think, from between Catholicism and most Protestantism, is that, it's not just the scripture. There's also tradition. And so you actually can enjoy certain sensual things as long as you keep your clothes on. I feel sympathy. I feel a certain degree of gratitude, a lot of gratitude, actually. And I'm glad that I've had the time to kind of read my way out of it and to experience my way out of it. And oddly for me, the thing that gives me not only comfort, but excitement and kind of grist for life is this whole idea of an evolving universe. And I learned about that from nuns. When I was in my adulthood, later on, I just happened upon these nuns who were teaching this stuff, and they don't believe that stuff anymore either.
They don't believe all the traditional religious stuff?
A lot of it they don't. And there are some nuns who do, and then there's some I met who don't. I mean, they're expressing their faith in a very different way than they were taught to do.
Is there a name for these nuns, or like a group of these nuns? Or?
There's Sisters of Earth, which is kind of a membership group of a lot of different nuns who believe this way, and also people who aren't nuns who believe this kind of thing. And, when I say belief, it's a belief that the story of the universe's evolution is always changing. It's not like it's deposited truth. It's always changing. We're always learning more, and that's a good thing.
So you learned about all this stuff from nuns, which is kind of neat in the sense that, there's this thread of Catholicism having influenced you in many bad ways, but then here are these nuns that have influenced you in a positive way after you left the faith. Right.
Absolutely. And these were the sisters who stayed after. A lot of nuns left after Vatican II because things opened up. And also it was during the women's movement, the beginning of the women's movement, or that wave of it. So women had more options to get an education and to have respect in their communities and to have leadership roles and things like that. And some of these women are remarkable. Some of the nuns that I've dealt with, since I left the church, they've run universities and hospitals, and they have their doctorates, and they're open-minded, and they're interested in different cultures, and really incredible people. So that's been kind of, and I appreciate very much the tradition they came from and how they have adapted it to a new way of thinking.
Yeah, that's really cool.
I'm sure the Vatican doesn't like it, but.
No, I'm sure they don't. Would you change anything about your experience? Your experience of going through all of this, being raised Catholic and then kind of losing your faith and that whole process?
No, not really, because it is very colorful. And, whenever you meet someone who went through the same kind of thing, like Catholic school, anywhere else in the United States or sometimes abroad as well, you automatically have a partner in crime. You have stories to tell. It was very colorful. It was very, you really, and there were good things that came of it. For example, there's this practice of examining your conscience. Am I doing the right thing? Did I do the right thing? Is there a way I could have done that better? I mean, that's a very good thing to know how to do in life, as long as you're not sticking your head up your ass about it and thinking that you're going to go to hell because you made a mistake.
Yeah, sometimes praying, like if I was, nervous about something or something bad was happening in my life, praying would always kind of center me. Mm-hmm. And I think now probably meditation's the kind of the thing that helps, before maybe you're going in for, a job interview, or you're going to a funeral, or you're doing something that's kind of difficult, instead of praying for peace, you find that peace,
So do you meditate?
Every once in a while. That's one of those things that, I try to do more of, but I'm not too good at doing more of. Mm-hmm. Kind of like with exercise, a lot of times, people are like, oh yeah, I try to exercise, but yeah, I find that it's very calming, and sometimes it really helps me feel, a lot more calm.
Yeah.
Settles me down a little bit,
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be a really complicated thing to do. It can
simple,
be.
Yeah.
You can go to all kinds of lengths in order to deal with certain issues in meditation. But yeah, I find that that's really an important thing. And just what is it to be human? We know so much more about that now than we ever did. We also know about animal intelligence. We know that animals act with each other in certain ethical ways. We are ethical by nature. That doesn't mean that people don't do bad stuff. But I wonder, when you say, do I wish that I could do it over again or something? I really wish people could understand that humans as primates have certain ethical practices. A lot of mammals do. We take care of each other. We make sacrifices. We protect our young. We try to take just what's ours and not hog it all, That's part of being human. That's one of the things you learn living on Earth, and it doesn't have to be a top-down thing.
Yeah. So kind of moving forward, or kind of, from the, now you're no longer Catholic, you have that tradition, but you mentioned those people coming to your door who were, missionaries, or maybe they were just going door to door, but
they were missionaries.
It makes me think of something that I always find interesting. What would you say is the biggest misunderstanding that Christians have about you as an atheist?
Oh, well, that atheists are bad people, or that atheists think that that this life is just crap, or that we're angry, or, and there are some atheists who are angry because we're a minority. So, but yeah, just that being an atheist is something bad, that there's something missing.
Yeah.
And I don't feel that way at all.
So what's the best thing about not believing in God anymore?
I don't vomit nearly as much.
That's a bonus.
There's just not this kind of sense of being watched all the time, for one thing, you can watch yourself. You can observe yourself and how you go through life, and watch yourself and see, am I mindful of what I'm doing? It's getting rid of that guilt and control, and somebody in the sky you can't see, who you're supposed to praise all the time, and not having to do that stuff. Not to mention, not having to go to church. You'd be bored.
Takes away a lot of anxiety and boredom.
Yes. I mean, I have plenty of anxiety, but anxiety and boredom.
Yeah, but that's something that gives you, that would have given you more anxiety, or maybe would have, I don't know, but at least that's not there.
I don't think I would be nearly as anxious as I am if I hadn't been raised Catholic. Or, any religion heavily, where the stakes are that high, where you can just blow it and go to hell, for all eternity. And, as far as like an afterlife is concerned, I don't really care. I mean, I think we're made of energy. Everything around us is made of energy. Some of it's more solid than others. And if my energy passes on, great. If, you just kind of mulch me out back, that's fine too. So
that's so funny. I feel so opposite. I want to live forever. I think that'd be awesome.
Really?
I mean, not live forever like a 95-year-old in a nursing home forever, but I don't know if somehow science could, preserve us and I don't know, maybe it sounds better than it really would be. That's probably the case.
Yeah, and there's a lot of...
It sounds a lot cooler. I think it's the whole heaven thing. It just is ingrained in my head, and I can't shake it. Just this eternal life thing. It just, sounds good, but probably wouldn't be as good as it sounds.
Well, I kind of enjoy mortality. I say that right now as someone who's very healthy. But I don't want to live forever. I think this is fine. I mean, will I do all the things that I'd like to do? No, but some of that is financial too.
Yeah.
Like this morning, being able to go skiing for the first time this year, being able to go cross-country skiing in the woods. That to me, being able to stand in the middle of the woods in the snow, and it's quiet and the snow is coming down and you see these tracks of, I'm not very good at tracking, of all different kinds of creatures and stuff. That I don't need much more than that, really.
Yeah, my next question was going to be, what brings you the most happiness in life? And I have a feeling where this is going, and I think it's having to do with nature, but...
Oh yeah, sure. Not only having to do with nature, but being part of nature. And realizing that we are part of nature, and my close relationships with people, and my dogs and animals, and just trying to figure out what other species are up to, and what. I mean, life is very interesting and fascinating.
There's so many things, right?
Yeah, there's like so much to learn, and that's a wonderful progression to go through, and I'm happy to be able to go through it.
So I started this podcast for the former Christian who has lost their faith or is losing their faith, or in your case, for a Catholic, who's lost their faith or is losing their faith.
Catholics are Christians.
Yeah. Sorry.
Fundamental Christians always think that Catholics are something else. We started it, dude. I know you did. I know that was part of the shocking thing for me, is finding out, we broke off from you. That's right. And who was it? Martin Luther, who was constipated, and Henry VIII, who wanted a divorce. So there you go.
That's how it happened. I love that, by the way. I love that a whole huge segment of Christianity, Protestantism, was because a king wanted to divorce his wife. I just think that's funny.
It is funny.
So I'll rephrase that, or I'll say that again, and I won't clarify because Catholics are Christians. So I started this podcast for a former Christian who lost their faith. So what encouragement or piece of guidance would you give someone who was like you, back in the day, who is starting to have these doubts and stuff? What kind of encouragement or advice would you give to them?
I would say explore the world around you. Read a lot. Find stuff that interests you and really explore it. Find what makes you feel excited and happy, and trust that, unless you're a psychopath or something, that, it will be good for you and good for the people around you. You can do it. That's what I would say. You can do it. There is so much to read that can help you out and give you new ideas. You can just bust open your life and live a bigger, more exciting life. And that you're a good person to begin with. Like I said, unless you're a sociopath or psychopath.
Yeah, sociopath.
In which case you have a disease. So
what resources or one resource or that you can think of that you would recommend for someone who's deconverting from Christianity?
Well, I would recommend Joseph Campbell, anything that he's written. Or you can even watch, like, The Power of Myth is available online, or Netflix has it or something. You can watch Bill Moyer's interview Campbell, who died, I think, in the 80s. If you wonder, well, if I don't have God, if I don't have belief, what do I do? If you're thinking, well, where do I find meaning? The structure or the story, the scientific story that has been very kind of clarifying and opening for me, I would suggest a book by Loyal Rue, R-U-E. His first name is Loyal. He is a retired philosophy and religion professor and a very good writer. And he wrote this very slim book called Everybody's Story, Wising Up to the Epic of Evolution. He was raised, I believe, Lutheran or some kind of Protestant, and he considers himself now naturally religious, which is a different thing altogether. He, doesn't believe in a deity. Also, any book by Thomas Berry, B-E-R-R-Y, who was a Catholic priest, but who got very involved in writing about the earth and the epic of evolution and what that means for humans and their role on earth.
Interesting. So if people want to get in touch with you, is there a good way for them to do that?
Yeah, they can come to my website, www.meetyourmyth.com, and send me an email or something. And, I'm happy to discuss stuff or share what I've learned with other people. And let me just congratulate you, Steve, for doing this podcast, because I think this is really important. And it's interesting, you wanted to be a pastor, and that's exactly what you're doing. You're doing pastoral work in a new context. And I think that's brilliant.
I think it's really interesting. Well, I appreciate that. And this is fun for me. I enjoy, I just realized, a couple months back, I just realized I really, I'll meet other atheists, and I one of the first things I want to know is, what's your story? Tell me what you went through. I'm really interested in that. Mm-hmm. And I don't think everybody has that same desire, or I learned that not everybody has that same desire. And there's other podcasts that interview people who've gone through this kind of thing, but they do other things too. They interview people about different subjects. But whenever it's a story like this, I've just always been drawn to it. And it's probably because it meant so much to me. That was such a significant part of my life. So yeah, I really, there's something about this that is really, it's healing and it's therapeutic, but it's fun too. I enjoy hearing what people went through. And there's always something, in someone's tradition or history that's unique, mm-hmm. that really kind of added a different flavor to their experience. And that's always fascinating to me. And
that's part of the way the world works, differentiation, variety. And, we're going through a period of incredible change right now. We're moving out of a techno-industrial system because it's not sustainable. We're moving out of a religious system that's not sustainable. We're becoming connected with each other through the internet and other means. And so I think people should take comfort in the fact that these are challenging times, but we're birthing something new. And it's important, and the more people get involved in that, the better.
Yeah. Well, and thank you for not just letting me interview you today, but you're also a big part of helping me kind of get this going. So I appreciate your support and your help, and it's been really fun talking to you today and hearing more about your story, because I knew a little bit about it, but now I got to hear a lot more, and it was very interesting, and it was fun to hear about. So
well, thanks, Steve. All the best to your listeners, and just it's in you to do it, to do the right thing. That's what I believe.
Thanks for listening to Voices of Deconversion. Be sure to join us next time by subscribing to the podcast. If you'd like to learn more, check out our newsletter at bodpodcast.com.